Hey everyone, R88 here. Like I said in my community post, we're doing something special today. And so, without further ado, I will be reading a chapter or a section from Kizuwatna, History of Cilicia in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, circa 2000 to 2000 and 1200 BC by Andrea Tremeri, published by Brill. I don't know if you prefer me to pronounce it as Cilicia or Kilikia. I know there's different pronunciations in the Greek. So, without further ado, let us start our reading with. I don't think you can see that. That's not better. A silent demise. Kizuwatna and the Hittite New Kingdom in the late 15th to mid 14th century. 6.1 The reign of Sunashara, or the reign of Sunashura under Mitanni. I apologize, my pronunciations on the up to date, and standardized, agreed upon, I guess, transcriptions of ancient Near Eastern words are not great. I can't, I'm not, I'm new to this. I do not have academic training on the ancient Near East, but I believe this is important to today's general, politics in the region. So yeah, King Sunasa, King Sunasura ruled one generation after Pelia. In the second half of the 15th century, in the second half of the 15th century, two contemporary documents that refer to Sunasura, the most notable being a well-preserved treaty with the Hittites, which provides important historical information. The other is a small tablet from Alalakh, which contains a verdict issued by the king of Mitanni, Shashtatar. His order resolves a quarrel between Shunashura and King Nikmepa of Alalakh, and the tablet is the response received by Nikmepa and stored in his palatial archives. Here it is, quoting the short text entirely. Anapani Sausha Ta'atar Lugal Nikmepa Ashum Alawari Iti Sunasura Dinam Ishbatma. Well, okay, that's a lacuna. Dinam is a lacuna. Ishbatma, another lacuna. Nikmepa Inadi Neem. The neem is in the tablet. Before Shashtatar, the king, Nikmepa brought a legal case against Sunasura regarding the possession of Alawari. Nikmepa won the case, and Alawari was returned to Nikmepa, the city Awa. There's a bunch of lacunas, and that's, you can't fill in too much in the translation, okay? Now, the text was sealed by Shashtatar, who employed the seal of an ancestor, possibly his grandfather. Su'ut ta arna dumu kirta lugal mai taini mai taini. So that probably says Mitani. I don't know if Dumu and Lugal, they're just classifiers or if you're supposed to read them. Because I know Lugal means king, so I don't know if the symbols indicate a king or if I'm supposed to also read king as in ruler. Now, here is the verdict. I know this is like the Dragon Warrior skull from Kung Fu Panda, but you have to trust me. There's stuff there. Now, in consideration of the content, the identification of Sunashura with the homonymous king of Kizuwatna is virtually certain. As in the case of ALT 3, all names, with the exception of Sashtatar, appear without titles. Nikmepa made a claim against Sunashura for the possession of a certain town, Alawari, which was probably located in Syria, beyond the Yamanus, and near the border between Alalakh and Kizuwatna. The text shows primarily that the decision of Shaustatar was in his favor, but also, because it is the arbitration of a superior authority, it means that both local rulers were subordinates of Mitanni. Interesting stuff. Now, Mitanni is kind of the Yugoslavia of the late Bronze Age. It it lasts a bit, it's powerful, but then it just kind of goes, and then the aftermath is kind of wild. Typologically, this unilateral deliberation can be distinguished from the contract ALT-E3, that's like some tablet, discussed previously. The former was a private negotiation between Pelia and Idrimi, and this difference is critical. The deliberation of the king of Mitanni demonstrates unequivocally a new situation in which Kizzuwatna is de jure a territory subordinate to the Mitannian kingdom, not dissimilar to Alalak. By this time, the Mitannian political influence over Kilikia appears to be at its apex. Oh, hey, I didn't mispronounce dissimilar. Um, this situation, of course, I felt like I had to jump over it, but like I actually stuck the landing. Felt like letting you know. Now, enough humor aside, I know I'm hilarious. This situation corresponds with some information included in the historical introduction to the Shunasura Treaty, probably stipulated sometime after the present document. The identification of Shunasura of the Alalak tablet with the king who signed the last treaty of Kizzuwatna with Hattusha depends also on the view one maintains of a broader problem that is decisive for the historical reconstruction of the period and for the attribution and interpretation of several documents. This is the complex question regarding the number of rulers bearing the name Tudalia in the early New Kingdom period from 4,000, no, not 4,000, 1,425 to 1,350 BCE. A new kingdom, the reign of Tudalia. The problem of Tudalia the First, Second, and the early New Kingdoms dynasty. A long-standing problem in Hittite studies concerns the identity of a number of rulers named Tudalia. In the New Kingdom, there had been 2 or 3 kings of this name. I wonder if there were 6 or 7 of them. Since this issue has ramifications for the attribution and interpretation of various documents, as well as the chronology of the period, a review of the main related questions is in order. The most notable implication for the history of Kizzuwatna derives from the fact that one Tudalia was the king who concluded a treaty with Shunashura of Kizzuwatna and who married Nikal Madi, a woman who, according to some scholars, was a princess or high-ranking person from Kizzuwatna. Thus, the identity of this Tudalia remains critical for a historical assessment of the period. One hypothesis claims that 2 Tudalias preceded Arnuwanda at the beginning of the New Kingdom. Like Beale, most scholars follow today the view of a minimum number of rulers in the early New Kingdom, thus only 1 Tudalia before Arnuwanda, a view disputed by a minority, in particular Fru, Karuba, and recently Taraka. Now, this is like, academic debates and things like that. I'm not telling you which one to support and not support. But, I'm going to read the things out there. I might not read out citations. That might, take too much time. But, respect to all the scholars who are doing these hard work. I know, there are all these heated disagreements. But, ultimately it's in the service of history. Fru criticized the elimination of some kings from the list, in quotes, namely one Tudalia and Hattusili II, as a collateral effect of the adoption of the low chronology, which became increasingly popular after the early 90s. This may be in part true, but in reality the middle chronology, as is in the case of the present work, only requires one to assume lengthy reigns for Tudalia I, Arnuwanda I, and Tudalia III. This is not unrealistic, nor is it contradicted by the evidence, as all these kings seem to have ruled for several years. Okay, page 316. Karuba always maintained his position, based primarily on content details and formal differences between documents of the period. According to him, 2 distinct rulers with the same name must have existed at the beginning of the dynasty, as the documentary situation was not compatible with a long reign of just one Tudalia I. More recently, the same view is maintained by Taraka, who in 2014 discussed the implications of the passage from the fragmentary tablet KBO 50.4, which still to this date probably posits the most important problem for a unitary view. This is the relevant section. Thus speaks Tabarna, Arnuwanda, great king, and Asmo Nikal, great queen, daughter of Tudalia, great king, hero, granddaughter of Tudalia, great king, hero. Now, this is like, there's some lacunas in this, but yeah. The nature and content of this fragmentary tablet remain unclear. If one follows the reconstruction proposed by Taracha, the introduction of this tablet seems to confirm a sequence of two Tudalias, one after the other, at the beginning of the new kingdom. De Martino wonders if a different reconstruction is possible, i.e., that Arnuwanda could be listed a second time after Asmonikal. If he was indicated there as adopted son of Tudalia, both references would refer to the same predecessor. However, it seems difficult to envision a suitable formulation, while the one proposed by Taraka seems plausible and provides a relatively simple solution. Recently, Miller came back to this question, discussing these previous views, and came up with a different, quite impactful solution. And then there's like kind of quoted, daughter of Tudalia, great king hero, and Tudalia, great king hero. A simple restoration with the conjugation U in place of S.A. Cha, I don't know how to pronounce that, makes the document a tablet issued by the royal couple and the heir, Tudalia III, implying a scenario where he had been co-regent of Arnuwanda at this point in time. This reconstruction must remain hypothetical as well, as there is no other information concerning a co-regency. It does, however, elegantly solve the issue, and stands as a very good option for restoring the text. Miller makes some good points, such as the familiarity of Arnuwanda with the institution of co-regency, since he had been also associated to the throne by his father. Interesting. As a matter of fact, any reconstructed formulation would have no parallels, and I suspect that a motivation can perhaps be sought in the exceptional status of Queen Asmo-Nikal, highlighted also in other documents. She was the biological daughter of Tudalia and Nikal Mahdi. We may thus remain open to a reconstruction which does not necessarily have previous parallels. Some scholars suggest that the so-called cruciform seal also distinguishes the Tudalia who married Nikal Mahdi from a previous Tudalia I. But this object is fragmentary and presents several interpretive problems. In brief, it is unclear which Tudalia is named in the upper wing of the seal. I'm not going to read all the footnotes, I'm sorry. These two alternative views can be summarized in the following scheme. A critical difference between the two options is the resulting attribution of some text. That case of one would be in the case of one would all belong to the same ruler, Tudalia I, while in the case of two can be split into two groups, each assigned to Tudalia I or the second. Now, let's read the footnote. Why not? We'll just do this one. The seal was created at the time of Mursili II with clear propagandistic interests. On its two sides, it lists important kings of the Old Kingdom and their queens. Side A, Labarna, Hattusili I, and Mursili I, and of the early New Kingdom before Shupililiuma. Tudalia I, Arnuwanda, Tudalia III, probably. See also Miller 2004, pages 7 to 9, and a detailed reanalysis with new suggestions for an interpretation in Stavey 2011. Other recent discussions on Simon 2020b, Campbell 2022, and I guess I should also mention that the original footnotes cites something edited by Dinchol et al. In 1993. Anyways, the choice is not insignificant for a history of Kisuwatna. For example, some have proposed that the manuscript tablets or the MS tablets of the Sunasara Treaty and other documents attributed to Tudalia should not be dated the same period. And there's like a chart that says, it's just wondering, hang on. You can't see that. It's like, Zidanza the Second, Zidanza the Second? Yeah, no, it's a genealogy. It's alternative reconstructions of the early New Kingdom dynastic sequence and possible attribution of some relevant documents. I'm not sure how to read this to you, so I'm just gonna, we're gonna pass that. Okay, now, back to it. For example, some have, Okay, so A. Scholars who follow this model will frequently, or is this the... No, never mind. It's the model for the figure. Okay, figure 37. Thus, consequently, even for the same ruler, so that's the should not be. So yeah, the whole thing is that not all these things can be dated the same early. For Pupko 2005, the Akkadian and Hittite manuscripts of the treaty must have been earlier than KBO 1510, a tablet describing a ritual for Tudalia and Nikal Mahdi and likely contemporary with their reign. This is most determined on paleographic grounds, as some documents, the earliest, show script characteristics distinct from others attributed to a second Tudalia and to Arnuwanda. The consequence would be that while the Treaty of Shunashura belongs to Tudalia I, it was another individual, Tudalia II, who married Nikal Mahdi and is the protagonist of some other documents, e.g., some of the analytic texts, option number 2, that's in the thing, for genealogy. Yeah, it basically describes, two different possibilities. If there was a Tudalia the first and a second, uh, yeah, I don't know why Zidanza's mentioned. I can't find him in the other one. It's some king. Don't worry about it. Now, whether hypothesis number 2, some scholars have also suggested that the various versions of the treaty itself should be separated. See infra 6.3.1 in detail, which would imply that two different Shunashuras also existed. Indeed, those who maintained that two early Tudalias, 1 and 2, existed also prefer this option, namely that one Shunashura was a contemporary with Shaustatar, and perhaps Tudalia the First, if one takes the first version of the treaty dating to Tudalia the First, and the second with Tudalia the Second. This is probably the main inconvenience of the hypothesis, which requires the holders to face the coincidence of a sequence of two Tudalias in parallel with two distinct corresponding Shunashuras in Kizuwatna. Principally for this reason, and the overall congruity of the evidence for a unitary view, the present studies follows the current convention that opts for one Tudalia only. At present, one must, however, admit that some key pieces of evidence remain at least in part unclear, notably the introduction to KBO 50.4, and neither view can be ultimately confirmed. Considering the impact of the issue on the history of Kizuwatna, the main implications of the different views were presented here as a caveat to the reader for the discussion of several topics presented in this chapter. Historical background. Oh boy, this is going to be a long one. Tudalia I came to the throne of Hattusha after a poorly documented phase of internal strife. The previous king, Muwatalli I, was murdered in a plot led by the Hittite noblemen Himuili and Kantuzili. Some scholars suggested that these two individuals could have ties, political or familiar, with the previous ruler, Huzziya, who was murdered by Muwatalli himself. If so, after the murder of Huzziya and the usurpation of the throne, Muwatalli may have assigned or confirmed them to high offices, in the attempt to create reconciliation among the Hittite elites after this troubled phase. It hardly seems plausible that the Kantuzili of the plot is someone different from the father of Tudalia. This genealogy is attested in a famous seal found in 1999 and confirmed in some analytic fragments. While Tudalia I is sometimes credited with beginning a new dynasty, which emerged from one of the factions that gained ascendancy in the power struggle, he and his father may have well belonged to the main dynastic line interrupted by the previous usurpation of Muwatalli I, or to the extended royal clan. Ultimately, while we know nothing of the genealogy of Kantuzili, the alternative hypothesis that Tudalia belong to a different clan of Hurrian descent is unwarranted. This is the opinion of Tracha, who suggested that the new dynasty potentially came from Kizuwatna, as the cultural influence from this territory in the early New Kingdom and the new royal onomastic tradition indicates. One argument he puts forward is that throughout the New Kingdom, the eldest sons of the king, the heirs to the throne, were given alternatively the names Tudalia and Arnuwanda, which is clearly a new custom. While for Taraka, this new tradition has a Kizuwatnan connections because these two names derive from sacred mountains located in the vicinities of Kumani, this connection is unlikely. Both were certainly mountain names, but there is no reason to think they were located in Kizuwatna. Actually, since Arnuwanda was probably not a biological son of Tudalia, the explanation of a deliberate onomastic choice within the dynastic family does not apply. More importantly, it seems hard to square the hypothesis with the presence of Kantu Zili at the court of Muwatalli I and his high status as if he was in fact a Kizzuwatnian. It seems far more likely that the family of Tudalia belonged to the Hittite elites and was perhaps even of royal rank, if he could even claim and then maintain the throne. While a direct connection between the origins of Tudalia and the early New Kingdom Hurrianization should be excluded, one can find another compelling explanation for these phenomena through the political and personal connection this ruler established with Kizzuwatna, as discussed in detail in this chapter. Most notably, this could have happened through his marriage to Nikal Mahdi, if she was a Kizzuwatnian princess or noblewoman. The installation of Tudalia as king may have been motivated by the decision to concede the throne to someone not directly involved with the assassination of the predecessor, and who, supposedly, had at the same time significant rights to claim it. The likely turbulent beginning of his reign was characterized by new struggles with a revenge-seeking faction loyal to Muwatalli I, led by Muwa, chief of the bodyguard of the Gal Masedi of the former king. Tudalia and his father opposed and eventually defeated Muwa and his army, supported by Hurrian allies, in events described in the fragmentary historiographic text KUB 23.16. Although strictly speaking, Tudalia perhaps did not initiate a new dynasty, his kingdom certainly marked the beginning of a new era. In this case, the perception of modern scholars seemed to match quite well with the Hittite view of their own history. Tudalia maintained an important position in the historiographical memory, and in a special document like the Cruciform Seal, recognized his reign as a clear watershed, and at the same time anchored the new to the old kingdom's dynastic sequence. Hang on, give me a second, guys. Oh no. Oh, I can't read all this, dog. Okay, come on. Where does it end? Okay, I got like 56 pages left. Okay. I don't know if I'm going to read all that. The vision of Tudalia, political and cultural strategies for the conquest of Kizzuwatna. In this new era of the Hittite kingdom's history, Kizzuwatna played a central role, and the following sections will assess this role in detail. While previous historiographical literature has already addressed this topic to some extent, I would like to put forward here some proposals for interpreting the developments of this period as conscious and coherent political strategies concerning Kizzuwatna, initiated at the time of Tudalia I, and that can be seen as part of a more far-reaching project of territorial incorporation. For the present discussion, there are two main themes of interest. The first falls within the political sphere and regards the diplomatic process that led to the actual annexation of Kizzuwatna to the Hittite kingdom. The second is the substantial cultural impact of the annexation of Kizzuwatna for the cultural history of the Hittite kingdom, an aspect deeply intertwined with the political dynamics. A more detailed outline of the introduction of the Kizzuwatna cults and religious literature in central Anatolia is deferred to a dedicated chapter, as this topic requires addressing a series of specific questions. The probably lengthy reign of Tudalia I inaugurated a new phase of remarkable political and military achievements. This is not the place to discuss this topic in detail, but a brief overview will be useful to introduce and contextualize those aspects of his political action which specifically involved Kizzuwatna. The closest model for Tudalia's aggressive policy of military expansionism were the campaigns of the early kings of the Old Kingdom. However, the political project of Tudalia can also be considered more consistently imperialistic in nature. Indeed, some credit him as the true founder of the Hittite Empire, and define the period preceding Suppiluliuma the first as the early empire period. While it appears clear that only with Suppiluliuma did the kingdom acquire the configuration of an empire in substance, it does not seem inappropriate to identify in Tudalia at least the roots of a Hittite imperial project, because his systematic approach to territorial conquests and his adoption of new strategies for integrating new territories in the kingdom's domain, as was the case for the progressive incorporation of Kizzuwatna, It seems that Tudalia's military agenda extended once again to northern Syria, an objective practically abandoned since at least the time of Telepinu, at almost 1 century earlier. At this time, the Hittites could perhaps have taken advantage of a difficult moment for Mitanni, weakened by several years of Egyptian incursions promoted by Thutmose III. From 479 to 425 BCE, that's like his reign. An aggressive foreign policy which found a halt only in the last decades of his reign. The growing power of Assyria in northern Mesopotamia may have been a factor too. Hank, Hattusili, you must destroy Assyria now. Don't let it grow. Anyways, yeah, the Middle Assyrian Empire was, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Better than the Neo Assyrian empires. I like Tukulti Ninurta, but Neo Assyrian emperors were brutal, but they aren't relevant here. Okay, it's just you, me, Kizuwatna, and the expanding Hittite Empire. Anyhow, it is understandable that during the time of conflict with the Egyptians, Mitanni increasingly struggled to keep a hold on Kizuwatna, which sometime between the reign of Pelia and Shunashura had even become a subordinate state. Consequently, it is within the broader context that the Hittites could take action and deprive the enemy from its strategically important ally. Contemporary documents do not describe the Syrian campaigns of Tudalia, and there are only indirect references from later texts. The conquest of Aleppo by a King Tudalia is in fact mentioned only in the historical introduction of the Treaty of Mursili II with Ptolemy Sharuma of Aleppo. This is more likely the earliest Tudalia, as these events fall neatly within the context of his military expansion project, even though a reference to Tudalia III cannot be entirely excluded. Text written in analytic format, collected under CTH 142, described instead the substantial military achievements of Tudalia and western Anatolia, where the Hittites reached the Aegean area by conquering Ashua. A wonderful original document of this time is the Aegean Sword, inscribed with a dedication by Tudalia I after the successful campaigns in these territories. In the east, he managed to conquer Ishua and achieve victories against the Kashka in north-central Anatolia. Therefore, his extensive campaigns reach unprecedented distances, especially in the west, although it is clear that a durable control could not be achieved in any of these areas. With the successors of Tudalia, in fact, the Hittite kingdom endured a new phase of crisis. In foreign politics, the other highlight of the kingdom of Tudalia was a new diplomatic policy towards its neighbor Kishuatna, which led to its factual annexation either in the later part of his reign or under his successor Arnuwanda. Apparently, its incorporation into the Hittite kingdom did not happen through military conquest, so a different strategy must have been adopted, as signaled in particular by a new alliance treaty. While the possibility cannot be excluded that war led to this stipulation, the document does not refer to any previous conflict. The competition with Mitanni played out entirely on the diplomatic field, and in this way the Hittites finally managed to overturn the extant alliance between Mitanni and Kizuwatna. The Mitannian crisis in the central decades of the 15th century BCE presumably contributed to this geopolitical realignment. While the details of this process of annexation and its actual formalization remain unknown, some hints can be drawn from this important historical source. My back. The treaty between Tudalia I and Shunashura. The treaty between Tudalia and Shunashura is certainly one of the most important historical documents on Kizuwatna. For a long time, the dating of this text remained uncertain, and because the name of the Hittite king could not be read in any of the available copies. Among the many attributions, a dating between one of the earliest Tudalia, 1 through 3, and Shupiliuma I seemed the most likely. After collation of the tablet in 1988, Gernot Wilhelm showed that in the partly preserved first line of the copy KBO 1.5, the name of Tudalia could be restored. Despite this finding, there is still discussion around the attribution of this text for two reasons. One depends on the issue of how many kings named Tudalia had lived at the beginning of the new kingdom, while the second concerns the complex documentary situation of the treaty. In fact, the tablets, both in Akkadian and Hittite, rather than being copies of the same document, appear to be different versions of the treaty. There is broad consensus that the text should be attributed to Tudalia I, within the model of only one early Tudalia. If this is the case, the various versions should all be attributed to the same ruler despite their differences. Of course, for those who just suggest there were two Tudalias, it is possible to distinguish versions of the treaty that can be assigned to one or the other, a view that almost certainly requires that two parallel Shunashuras also existed. Before Wilhelm provided the reading of the name of the Hittite king, KBO 1.5, Beale had already proposed arguments for the simplest solution, i.e., that there must be one Shunashura and that he was contemporary with Tudalia I. Eventually, within the option of two Tudalias without a Hattushili II in between, one may assume a reign of Shunashura long enough to be contemporary with both. The text has been treated in various works, and this section only deals with aspects primarily significant for the history of Kizuwatna. Given the particular complexity of the documentary situation, a brief summary of the philological background is necessary. Afterwards, our focus will be the treaty's historical prologue, its normative content, and its political historical implications. Documentary, the overview. Okay, that's the provenance. Akkadian versions, KBO 1.5. Of the best preserved version is a two-column plano-convex archival tablet. The reference of this to the seal of the Hittite king suggests that this copy contains the final version of the treaty. Still, the document seems incomplete, as it lacks the list of divine witnesses and the section with curse formulae. It is unclear whether it lacks part of the normative content as well, namely the end of the section about the borders. If this was the case, however, it would be necessary to assume that a second tablet existed, which for this type of document seems unlikely. A concise conclusion cannot be excluded. Potential examples are the endings of the contracts and treaties from Alalak, such as ALT2, treaty between Nikmepa and Irteshob of Tunip, or ALT3, previously 5.6. As in other Akkadian documents from Hattusha, some linguistic peculiarities of KBO 1.5 reveal that the scribes were not native speakers. In this version, the historical prologue and normative sections are compatible with 1.2a. This text, however, is shorter and significantly lacks the names of the parties. The surviving portion of the text refers to the Hittite king by his title and to the king of Kizuwatna implicitly, employing the second person. It also lacks the border descriptions, but it features a short list of gods in the curses section. The tablet format is interesting, as this appears to be a narrow and tall one-columned tablet with no paragraph divisions, and which was pre-ruled. Wilhelm 2014a provided a detailed overview of the content differences between the two main Akkadian copies. And then there's like an asterisk down, I guess, to the bottom. My throat. Pain. The Hittite versions, 2.1 and 2.2, or II.1 and II.2, mention Shunashura several times, but the relationship to the Akkadian manuscripts is difficult to assess. The main problem is that there is no overlap between the two versions of the preserved passages. Notably, the Hittite copies do not feature parts of the historical prologue or the borders descriptions, but only one preserved the normative segments. An interesting aspect of the version II.2 is that it refers to Mitanni, Kur-Uru Mitanni, while the Akkadian version never uses this name, but the form the land of Huri, Kur-Uru Huri, typical of earlier Hittite documents. Relationship between the various versions. The best preserved version is the Akkadian one, and this seems to be the definitive form of the text. The clear differences among the tablets have found various explanations. Since most manuscripts are of early date, compatible with the stipulation of the treaty, their differences may reflect various stages of the treaty's editorial history. The fact that the Hittite and Akkadian versions have no passages in common also suggests some tablets were just preparatory drafts whose content did not end up in the final document. Instead, the possibility that the fragmentary versions were different treaties issued in different moments during the reigns of Tudalia and Shunashura, that is to say, the treaty had been reviewed more than once, seems contradicted by the content of KBO 1.5, likely the last version, which in its introduction does not refer to previous arrangements with Views on the potential chronological distance between the versions vary according to the general interpretations of the tablet's corpus. Kitchen and Lawrence, for example, highlighted that the Hittites version seemed to show a clear paritarian character if compared to the Akkadian ones. See the following passage, one of the few that can be compared with different tablets. I'm not reading the court, I'm reading the translation, dog. If the king of the land of Mitanni starts hostility with the king of the land of Hattusha, Shunashura will not provide him with auxiliary troops. He will not let him go through the middle of his country. He will protect his country. Lacuna, with troops and chariots, he will not come. If Shunashura wants, it seems good to literally it seems good to Shunashura. He will come in aid question mark though for the Lacuna to my son. If he does not want, literally it is not good. He will not come. If the king of the land of Mitanni starts hostility with the land of Kijuwatna, if my son wants, he will go in aid of Shunashura. If he does not want, he will not go. If some country in the Akkadian, if some country begins hostilities against my son, this land for Shunashura is covered by his oath. If my son requests auxiliary troops from Shunashura, Shunashura will provide him an auxiliary troops, and there's a lacuna. If some country begins hostilities against Shunashura, this land for my son is covered by his oath. If Shunashura requests auxiliary troops from my son will provide him an auxiliary troops. In summary, the purely voluntary nature of mutual support of war in the Hittite version diverges from the Akkadian one, where mutual help has become mandatory. For Kitchen and Lawrence, this represents a flagrant and intolerable contradiction, implying a more complex evolution of relations with worsening conditions for Kizuwatna. They believe these two versions were created under two different rulers at some chronological distance, suggesting a later date for the Akkadian version. Disregarding Wilhelm's restoration, which provided the name Tudalia in the first line of KBO 1.5, they maintain that the Akkadian version may be attributed to Shupiliuma I, while the Hittite one can be dated to Tudalia I. Similarly, Hoang Tenkate and Frew distinguish two treaties and two Shunashuras. Stavy opts for two treaties, but one Shunashura with a long reign. Actually, these two passages show several underlying differences and should not be compared as if they were parallel sections in two different versions of the treaty. Notably, one refers only to Mitanni, whereas the other to generic enemies. But even if one wants to compare them, the reciprocal nature of their clauses is indeed maintained to all effects. I'm sorry, my English is it's failing. Only the specific formulation has changed. As for supposedly more evident paritarian character of the Hittite version, one cannot overlook the fact that a long section of enough reciprocal content is present also in the main Akkadian tablet. The mixed paritarian and non-paritarian content of the latter can be explained through the usage of previous diplomatic materials, but it does not necessarily imply that two versions of the treaty had existed. Rather, the composition employed the older diplomatic repertoire as source material. The different forms of text attested in the tablets can thus be interpreted as drafts or preparatory materials for the final document, including the Akkadian fragment and KBO 28.110 plus. The existence of Hittite fragments suggests either that versions in both languages were issued or that translations were prepared for internal purposes. Give me a second. I'm not reading all that. I'm sorry. Yeah. Hang on, let me see. Is there a full translation of the treaty? It's an appendix. Hang on, sorry, give me a second. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so my voice needs to rest, but I got an aura farm. I'm not just gonna read the summary. So the grind must continue. The historical prologue uh, and the diplomatic premises. The treaty with Shunashura is the first Hittite text of its kind to include a historical introduction, a feature distinctive of Hittite treaties with the broader Near Eastern diplomatic corpus. These prologues dealt with previous relations between the two parts and with other events of interest for the stipulations. There are various interpretations for the function of these historical introductions. Propagandistic. Oh God, I'm gonna pass out. Are more strictly juridical, on the basis of the relationship of loyalty. Oh wait, that's for more information. Korchek, 1931, and or legal, Altman, 2004. The prologue was exploited to project a certain historical background on the treaty and to communicate a certain perspective about it. We can do this, boys. The content defines some important premises for the treaty stipulations, namely that Kizuwatna now reinstates an alliance with Hattusha after it had been politically tied to Mitanni for some time. The precise circumstances of this change of banner are not made explicit, and the prologue is uniquely constructed if compared with other examples from Hittite treaties. Rather than explaining a history of previous relations between the Hittite kingdom and Kizuwatna, it is based on a parallel cited as an exemplum. This story illustrates the origins of hostilities between Hattusha and Mitanni. It is stated that originally, at the time of my grandfather, the people of Ishua had settled into the land of Huri, but later they sought refuge with the Hittites in Ishua. When they later revolted against the Hittites and Tudalia I repressed the sedition, they fled the country again into the Hurrian territory. The Hurrians refused to return them and even intervened militarily, plundering Ishua and taking prisoners. According to the Hittites, with these actions, the Hurrian man, i.e., the king of Mitanni, had broken the oath. This story has no direct connection with the content of this treaty, but the present situation is, essentially, compared to this historical precedent, to justify the political conduct of Hattusha and Kizuwatna against Mitanni, and to show the legitimacy of the Hittite claims. Liverani explained convincingly that the counterfeit reality of this parallel and its only apparent symmetry. It's very clear that the main preoccupations of this peculiar narration are to stress to stress the ancient tradition of positive relations with Kizuwatna. 2. To create a forceful comparison with the case of Ishua. 3. To condemn Mitannian behavior. And 4. To suggest that the return of Kizuwatna to the Hittite alliance is just under all possible it's just under all possible points of views, as in righteous. The structural qualities of this historical preamble are common to all other prologues, as Zaccagnini noted. Prologues are organized as sequences of historical phases charged with opposite connotations, positive or negative. There is a model situation in mind, according to which positive diplomatic antecedents were interrupted by a phase of hostility, which is followed by the new agreement. The treaty represents thus the last positive stage, and aims at resolving the conflict and reestablishing the original order. For these characteristics, historical prologues became functional. One could say were designed for subordination treaties. In this respect, the treaty with Shunashura stands out clearly within the corpus of the Hittite Kizuwatna treaties. Sorry, I felt myself actually maybe passing out. While the rest of the prologue is dedicated to the quarrel involving Ishua and Mitanni, only the first few lines of the text provide direct information on the earlier diplomatic relations with Kizuwatna in retrospect. Seal of, and there's a bunch of lacunas here, but or Lakana, I don't know how to pronounce that. Seal of Tudalia, great king, king of the land of Hattusha, hero. When with Shunashura, Lakuna, without any guess, between them an oath they swore, and they concluded this treaty with one another. Formerly, in the time of my grandfather, the land of Kizuwatna was on the side of Hattusha. Afterwards, however, the land of Kizuwatna defected, seceded from Hattusha, and turned to the land of Huri. A few essential bits of information in these lines concern the arrangement of a new treaty with Shunashura, reasonably mentioned in Lacuna, and a laconic account of a past diplomacy between the two kingdoms. But what is the specific meaning of lines 5 through 7? 5 and 7 is like the formerly in the time and my grandfather defected at Hurry, that stuff. The translation of the verbal form ibashi literally means had become that of the land of Hati. It's not entirely straightforward, and interpretations from the idea of full territorial possession and incorporation into the Hittite kingdom to one more nuanced of political affiliation or allegiance, and eventually to that of a tributary or client state. So different translations are was on the side of Hati, era dalla parte del regno di Hati, came into the possession of Hati, had become part of the land of Hati. Hordas land Kizuwatna verbunditor des Landes Hati geworden. Sorry for my German. Became part of the Hati land. Wurde das Land Kizuwatna ein zum Lande Hati gehöriges Land. Kizuwatna formerly he belonged to Hati. It become a vassal of one's own volition, and then started to belong. Those are just different things of the phrase. I guess ibashi or yeah. Ibashi is a form of, I think, a word bashu, which is like a noun or something. I'm not good with this stuff. I'm sorry, guys. Schweimer argued for a reading to be an ally after comparison with a similar formation found in one of the Hittite tablets of the treaty. Yeah. Of the treaty. The passage of interest is unfortunately very fragmentary, but the clause ma'a na as za ma sha utu shi ki sha KB 36.127 obverse 4, I think that is, says, if he does not become that of my son, Lacuna, is a perfect Hittite equivalent of Shah Ibashi. Since this parallel passage deals with the regulations for Shunashura, who seems to be free to decide whether or not he will support the Hittite king in case of aggression, here the meaning is more likely to be an independent ally rather than a vassal. In support of this interpretation, Schweimer also convincingly argues that the Akkadian of this tablet, also in other circumstances, reveals Hittite linguistic interference, which explains this expression as a calque of the Hittite original formulation, more familiar to the composers. J. Miller, however, recently opposed this argument, pointing out that the passage in question may refer to Mitanni rather than to Shunashura in his view. In his view, both instances should be read as evident statements of subordination, especially on the basis of comparison with parallels from later vassalage treaties, where the same terminology is employed. In those treaties, to become of someone clearly meant to become a servant. While Miller indeed makes a good point by highlighting the parallel usage by vassalage treaties, the fact that KB 36.127 refers to Mitanni rather than to Shunashura, in my view, strengthens Schweimer's interpretation. As far as concerns this text specifically, is it realistic that the passage refers to the possibility of Mitanni becoming a Hittite subject? That, my friends, is called foreshadowing. Partially. If you know, you know. In other words, that the Hittite diplomats were so bold as to, I feel like, 30 years. I don't know the exact chronology of Hittite Hanegalbot. Don't at me, man. I'm sorry. In other words, that the Hittite diplomats were so bold as to air, in an official document, the concept that Mitanni could become a vassal, particularly of its own will. I mean, that's some new kingdom, well, I guess in general, Egyptian inscription level egos, man. Now, note that the phrasing itself, by means of the hypothetical sentence, strongly implies that the counterpart may not be quite agreeable to this quote-unquote option, as one obviously expects, In context, a reading such as if they, i.e., Mitanni, do become vassals, but if they do not, i.e., want to become vassals, constitutes a very strange concept, in my view. I would argue that instead, the best explanation is to be sought in a possible spectrum of usage of the phrase in diplomatic context, showing an evolution of meaning. The basic meaning, to be an ally, which is contextually more convincing in the Treaty of Shunashura, did not change at all, but remained in use later on, as usually happens with diplomatic jargon, being employed in euphemistic terms to downplay the reality of subordination. After all, this kind of process begins precisely, to our knowledge, with the Shunashura Treaty, first showing significant signals of a clear imbalance in relations. Indeed, one may suggest that in the Shunashura Treaty, the phrase is already euphemistic, but this remains an issue separate from the essential meaning of the sentence. As for the usage in the Hittite fragment KUB 36.127, it seems still more likely that the meaning here is to be an ally, especially if the text refers to Mitanni, since it is to be excluded that Mitanni could ever decide to become a vassal. Okay, yeah, no, we're skipping a chunk of pages, and now we're going to other stuff. The annexation of Kizuwatna to the Hittite kingdom. The process which led to the final incorporation of Kizuwatna is quite obscure, and there are no explicit sources. This clearly began during the reign of Tudalia I, and was probably concluded with the reign of his successor, Arnuwanda I. Signals of this process are to be found in the content of the treaty with the Shunashura and the broader phenomena of cultural contact between the two kingdoms in this period. Already by the end of the first Tudalia's reign, the Hittite king had been involved in cultic provisions in Kizuwatna, and there is evidence of his interest in regional religious affairs visible in procedures such as the transfer of the cult of the goddess of the night from Kizuwatna to Samuha. Okay, yeah, no, definitely interfering. Samuha is like also North Central Anatolia, if I remember correctly. Some scholars have proposed that before the conclusion of the treaties, the Hittite kingdom and Kizuwatna had a military showdown. Cool, stabby stab stuff. Love that. In particular, Karuba, on the basis of his interpretation of the analytic fragment KUB 23.16, Tudalia and his father Kantuzili waged war against a faction of nobles previously loyal to Muwa Tali I. Muwa, the Gal Masedi, chief of the bodyguard of the former king, allied himself with the Hurrians against the new Lumes Masuru Hurlas. I don't know what that means. Maybe some guy's named Hurlas. Maybe that was a way of them saying Hurrians. Against the new Hittite ruler, and he guided the faction's troops together with a certain Kartasura. This Kartasura was presumably a high-ranking Mitannian military leader, as is strongly suggested by his Indo-Aryan name, Kurtasura. I have an Indo-Aryan name. That's cool. Traditional for the Mitannian dynastic echelons. Karuba proposed and said this could be also be a mercenary leader from Kizuwatna, or even a Hurrian king of Kizuwatna, but there was no information in the text about the direct involvement of Kizuwatna in the conflict. Kartasura is clearly affiliated with the Hurrians, i.e. Mitanni, and it seems also unlikely that, if Kartasura was the king of Kizuwatna, the text would not mention this significant fact. Essentially, the possibility that Kizuwatna was involved is based only on the premise that at this time, before the treaty, it was still under the control of Mitanni. The fragmentary annals of Arnuwanda suggest that later on, during his co-regency with Tudalia, the Hittite kingdom had come to control Kizuwatna directly. Chronologically, there is a good chance that Shunashura was dead by this time, and we do not know if he had any successors, so I wonder if this is like a Roman client kingdom thing where, for one reason or another, sometimes maybe a little stuff, maybe out of the goodness of their hearts, many of these client vassal kings kind of will their kingdoms directly to Rome, like the Roman Republic, so that sounds... But I mean, if this guy was always intermarrying, maybe it worked out, it wasn't like as much pressure, and I mean, there was going to be some, but yeah, that's my thing, okay? I could be totally wrong. This is not my subject area. I just find the Hittites cool. The beginning of the fragment refers to reconstruction activities of Zunahara and Adania, which are with a reference to the building of a bridge, and in other cities, among which are Sinuwanda, Hiya, and then there's blank, it's like a Lakuta, yeah, and then 104 it mentions, for reading Hiyawa, see previously 2.3, page 41. Give me a sec. I want to see why I say Hiyawa. Hiyawa is like the name of a Neo-Hittite / Luwian state in the Iron Age. Okay, so it may or may not be. I don't know. I'm not gonna get too much into it. Anyways, let's just go back. I forget I said that. Okay. And Zulita. Although the locals apparently did not engage in battle, immediately after, a text deals with the elevation of Arnuwanda to the throne and the successful expedition against Arzawa carried out by him and Tudalia the First. The two sections may be disconnected, being spaced out by the passage describing the co-regency of Arnuwanda. Thus, the Hittite troops did not necessarily march through Kizuwatna from the southeast in order to reach Arzawa. The protocol issued by Arnuwanda for the Ishmerigans. Michigan? Did the Hittites conquer Michigan? I'm just kidding. Ishmerigans. Sounds like Muskegon. Sorry. Ishmerigans provides another reference point for the annexation of Kizuwatna. This document indicates the power of Arnuwanda to relocate individuals within Kizuwatna, indicating his full authority over its territory, and indeed, other details indicate even more clearly its new provincial status. If someone speaks an evil word before you, whether... Sorry, this is a quote. KB 23.68, verse 21 to 24. I take it that means lines? I don't know. If someone speaks an evil word before you, whether he's a governor of a border province, or he's a nobleman, or if he's one of modest rank, or if he is a Hittite, or if he is a Kizuwatnian, let's see, maybe it's reconstructionist of Kizuwatnian, and then there's two lacunas. No one shall conceal the one that speaks an evil word, but shall rather seize him and make him known. This provision demonstrates that both the territory of Kizuwatna and his people are considered an integral to the kingdom. In a previous fragmentary paragraph, concerning questions of alliance and loyalty, it is specified that whether an enemy blank into Kizuwatna and you hear of it, you will blank. Again, showing that Kizuwatna was, at this point in time, counted within the borders of the state. The annexation was also demonstrated by the appointment of attachés of the king in Kizuwatna, chosen from within the Hittite royal family and bearing the title of Sangha, high priest. We can do it. We can do it, guys. The first of these political figures were a son of Arnuwanda and a brother of Tudalia III, Kantuzili, and later on we know of the appointment of Telepinu, one of the sons of Supiliuma. Kantuzili had extensive administrative authority at a regional level, which means that at least by this time, the local dynasty must have ceased to exist. And now that the office of priest clearly embodied the highest political authority, but documents dating from the time of Arnuwanda I and Tudalia III reveals that the situation was more complex than a peaceful, gradual process of integration in the south. Texts from the reign of Arnuwanda I, in particular prayers, suggest that the kingdom faced hard times after the extensive campaigns of Tudalia, and reveal its inability to maintain stable control over territories that were too vast. At about this time, Mitanni had a comeback after years of crisis. Shaushtatar overcame Assyria, and the kingdom was even able to make an alliance with Egypt. Diplomatic correspondence with Egypt had begun at least by the time of Artadama, who made overtures and parleys and finally agreed to concede a daughter to the king of Egypt in order to reach a durable agreement on the Syrian frontier. The detailed chronology of these events and the whole period is still shaky, but this phase likely begins in the last years of the reign of Tudalia I or soon afterwards. So I guess it's before, the whole Blitzkrieg or whatever of, Shupiliuma I and, I think his dad, where they go back in, North Syria. I don't know, maybe some earlier kings before that did too. I'm not an expert. The stipulation of the situation was especially critical in the north, as signaled by the series of treaties stipulated by Arnuwanda with the Kaska tribes. The treaty with the people of Ura in western Kilikia, previously mentioned, also falls in the same political context. A prayer of Arnuwanda and Osman-Nikal mentions these difficult times as well, with particular reference to the disastrous ravages of the Kashka to the north. It laments the painful loss of the holy city of Nerik and the consequent interruption of the worship of the gods in the land. These years of crisis correspond also with the possible transfer of the royal court to Sapinua Ortakoi, where Tudalia III built a new palace. The archaeologists excavating the site proposed that this had even temporarily been the capital of the kingdom. It seems, though, that the city was destroyed at some point in the 14th century, BCE, of course. These conflicts may have also. Dude, imagine if it was CE though. Like, imagine like the Hittites were like fighting like the Timurids or like the Ottomans. That would be goaded. Um, these conflicts may have also, and like, what was it? One of those Byzantine successor states or something on Pontus. Anyways, back to reality. These conflicts may have also involved Kizuwatna. In fact, a unique document may indicate that the military actions had to be undertaken locally. It is the fragment of a Hurrian text found in 2005 at Khayali Pinar, Samuha. This tablet is also particularly interesting because texts of this kind with this kind of content were up to then unknown within the Hurrian corpus. It deals with actions undertaken by two individuals in the regions of Kizuwatna, Mukesh, and Mitanni, perhaps in the context of military campaigns. Towards the beginning of the fragment, Kizuwatna and Alalach are mentioned, along with Zunahara, Mitanni, is it Zunahara? Maybe Zunahara, Mitanni, and Winuwanda, another toponym found in other sources, alongside Kizuwatnian centers. The two protagonists of the story, Egli Tenu and Ili Sharuma, have Hurrian's names. In Von Dessau's recent discussion, the first was dispatched or just traveled to Mitanni, the second to Winuwanda, which later in the text seems to be the seat of some military activities. The text is difficult, however, and only bits of the narrative can be picked up. Whedon, for example, follows the interpretation of the first editors, according to which the text witnesses campaigns under Hittite command against Mitannian holdings in Mukesh. I think I might actually have a heart attack from reading. I'm sorry, this is not a diss to the author. It's fine. I just should have had a bottle of water. Or read the chapter, left that chapter. Given the geographical context of the document, its language, and the names of these persons, it seems indeed possible that this text may even have originated in Kizuwatna and was only later delivered to Samuha. The dating of the tablet ranges between the time of Tudalia I and Tudalia III, with most scholars preferring the latter. This is preferable, especially since the text is in Hurrian, but recently Von Dessau suggests that its context may refer to earlier events, which also fit well with the reign of Tudalia I around 1400 BCE, perhaps in the context of the final shift of the alliance of Kizuwatna in favor of Hattusha. Four pages. The information might also synchronize well with the last years of Tudalia III, aided by the general Shupiliyuma, hit an important comeback after the time of the concentric attack, when the Hittite kingdom lost Ishua, Armatana, Tegarama, and according to some scholars, most of Kizuwatna as well. Give me a second. I actually want to see something. Stubby. Come on. The reigns of Tudalia I, the contribution of Hittite documentation, and the... Oh, it's in my pocket. Let me cook a bit, okay, guys? I know. Shh. I think I found a new book. Okay, let me just do something. Mark up. Whoa. Easy. There. Now, to continue. Yeah, okay. And Kizuwana as well. This historical reconstruction depends chiefly on the reliability of the introduction of the decree of Hattusili III and Pudaheba. That's a weird transcription. I don't know. I'm not good at pronunciation. Pudaheba regarding the Hekur sanctuary of the god Pirwa, which provides an overview of events at this time, where the enemy made Kizuwatna, the city, the border. Mm. Since this document is much later, Bryce, for example, is cautious. Very likely our text has telescoped the events it records. This may have recounted incursions and events which occurred over a period of years as if they were part of a single massive enemy encirclement. Other hints to the process of annexation derive from the definition of Kizuwatna as a Kurewana land, a term whose exact meaning is not entirely transparent. It could be used in reference to countries or people. Kizuwatna is so defined in a manuscript hymn for the sun goddess of Arena, a text that was incorporated almost verbatim into a later prayer of Mershili II for the sun goddess. The interesting thing about the usage of this terminology is that only the earliest version of this composition includes Kizuwatna, together with the land of the Hurrian and Arzawa, among Kuriwana territories. In Kuriwana, territories that, at that particular moment in time, were hostile to Hattusha. The countries of Kuriwana that are all around, the land of the Hurrian, the land of Kizuwatna, the land of Arzawa, and I guess another one is that it says the land of Mitanni and the land of Arzawa. Oh yeah, because it replaces Kizuwatna. Each one has become arrogant and does not respect/worship the gods. And the later prayer, copy A here, so that's where Mitanni comes in. The scribes evidently adjusted the list to exclude Kizuwatna. The deletion of Kizuwatna from the model text, otherwise followed literally, suggests it could not be considered Kurewana any longer, although it was so at the time in which the original text was created. Based on the type of text, it was composed between the time of Arnuwana I and the early reign of Shupililiuma I. While the basic meaning of the term, also on the basis of this passage, might be independent, autonomous, the definition has been translated variably. Among recent proposals, independent, protectorate, autonom lander, judicially equal. This ambivalent understanding results from the fact that Kurewana, in this and other contexts, might apply to a status somewhere between an independent kingdom and a vassal state, its position being superior to the latter and enjoying some privileges. This meaning would align well with the peculiar status of formal autonomy, but factual subordination of Kizuwatna during the early New Kingdom. And some of the concessions granted to Kizuwatna in the treaty with Shunashura, such as the exception from tribute and ceremonial prerogatives, as Beckman even called the treaty a Kurewana treaty, for it presents a facade allowing a previously powerful polity to retain a modicum of self-respect or respect while surrendering most of its independence. However, the question arises of how the term could also apply to Mitanni before its defeat by Shupililiuma I. See, I told you, foreshadowing, spoilers. I.e., how could have been used to indicate both a kingdom with intermediate status and one that was effectively independent? One possibility for maintaining the meaning, there's a typo, it says meaning, meaning independent, as Stavia suggested, is that at some point in the years of the crisis of the kingdom, Mitanni actually reclaimed control over Kizuwatna, and only later on was Tudalia III able to re-annex the region. It's so confusing, and we don't even know if Tudalia II was a dude, and we're still calling him like Tudalia. We don't know if he existed. We don't know if he's a dude. I don't know. I don't think the evidence supports him being a woman or something, but I guess it would work out. But yeah, only later on was Tudalia III able to re-annex the region. I don't know. Well, I'm not aware of any Hittite queen region or female ruler, but so I'm just wondering. I know Hatshepsut in Egypt, and some versions had to present herself in inscriptions as a man to fit that royal ideology revolving around masculinity, but she also did have things just kind of openly portraying her as a woman. So, I don't know. From my knowledge, the Hittites, well, yeah, they're socially conservative like all these other places, but, I don't know. I may have read somewhere that they were slightly more chill with that kind of stuff. I don't know. Uh, don't take that with just die of like salt inhalation with what I just said, because frankly I don't know. I'm not qualified to talk on that. Okay, after Tudalia was able, the third was able to re-annex the region. Only in this chronological interval in the early New Kingdom could Kizuwatna again be again Kurewana, i.e., independent, and this understanding compounds well with the crisis that the Hittite kingdom faced after the reign of Tudalia I. But this picture is necessarily tentative. Another problem is that Mitanni and Arzawa were certainly independent during the early New Kingdom, but in his prayer, Mursili II still recognizes them as Kurewana, and by this time they were certainly provinces of the empire. See, I told you, Hanagalbot. In order to explain this contradiction, the definition of Kurewana by Pofel might be the most convincing. The term identifies the status of a foreign entity, person, people, or country, which is formally independent, but in relation to a superior potentate or power, thus implicitly communicating a hierarchy of reference. We should bring back the word Kurewana. That actually works for like hegemony and stuff like that. That's my new political ideology, the Kurewana ideology. Semi-vassals. I wonder if it would apply to like imperial Chinese tributary states, because where they were like, they told the Chinese emperor that they were submitting to the Chinese emperor, but like really they weren't even like vassals or anything, because they weren't really like, a lot of time from what I've read, so a lot of times the tribute was like just gifts, like trade and stuff like that. That's kind of what you got to do when like every big emperor wants to think they're king of the world when like they're not. When they conquer something, they conquer it. It's not like the other like conqueree or whatever, like the recipient of the conquest is. It's not like they were necessarily rebelling. They could have been independent. But it goes against like cosmologies and things like that. Anyways, is thus implicitly. In other words, the term effectively. In other words, the term means effectively independent, but at the same time highlights the lower status of something being Kurewana in respect to some external superior authority. That's a baller name, Pigaya. Atarsia, that's a Greek guy. I remember that. And then Pigaya, I've never heard of that guy. Maruwada, that guy snapped, went crazy, invaded Cyprus. Yeah, another interpretation put forward by Paula Vidini. Paula Vidini, sorry for the name pronunciation, guys. I know I probably messed things up. Is that Kurewana here refers to the juridically equal or juridically evil. I feel like there's another I here, but I might be bad at English. Juridically equal status of the countries listed: Kizuwatna, Mitanni, and Arzawa. And the later version, just Mitanni and Arzawa. Wait. Hang on. Okay, then the change from the. Okay, yeah, so it does mention Mitanni, but it refers to them as the land of the Hurrian, I think. I don't know, I could have been reading that wrong. Yeah, but it does say in the later version just Mitanni and Arzawa, meaning Mitanni was in the first one. I thought Mitanni replaced Kizuwatna, but no, I think they referred to Mitanni as the land of the Hurrian, like the ruler. But that the term has no predetermined implications in terms of ranks. That is to say, that Kurewana refers to people or countries which have juridically equal status in a certain context of reference, irrespective of the fact that they are, for example, independent or subordinated to another authority, such as another kingdom or a ruler. This interpretation lies well to the available context because it solves the issue of having to establish the precise power dynamics of the relationship with the Hittite king/kingdom in all instances, as this can vary. Independent kings or free people can be Kurewana, equal to each other, just as vassals of the same king can likewise be Kurewana amongst themselves. Thus, this is also a convincing and valid alternative to the other interpretation. At the time in which the hymn of the sun god to the sun god was composed, whether Kizuwatna was considered juridically equal to the countries listed, and perhaps implicitly also to Hattusha, at least formally, or whether it was considered independent but of a lower status in relation to Hattusha, the term was appropriate. With the latter interpretation, it might seem odd that the hymn considers Mitanni inferior to Hattusha and on the same level as minor kingdoms like Arzawa and Kizuwatna, and perhaps one should understand this definition in derogatory fashion, at least for Mitanni. In the time of Mursili II, instead, it was probably still appropriate to define Arzawa and Mitanni as Kurewana, either because of their long history of independence, the later date of their conquest, and perhaps the fact that they enjoyed the benefits of a degree of local autonomy from the Hittite administrative apparatus, or because they were judicially equal within the imperial structure. It was clearly no longer the case of Kizuwatna, which since the early New Kingdom had already become an integral part of the Hittite kingdom. Finally, after the annexation and the restoration of the borders for the kingdom by Tudalia III, if some territories were indeed lost, the fact that Hattusha and Kizuwatna had truly become one kingdom is indicated by the inclusion of the deities of Kizuwatna among the Hittite state gods in the diplomatic texts, at least from the time of Suppiluliuma I on. The earliest example is the fragment of the final part of the treaty stipulated with Mukish. Okay, there's some archaeology, but you know what? I changed my mind. We're reading the summary. As shown in this chapter, the annexation of Kizuwatna to the Hittite kingdom was a process whose modalities and political details are still largely unclear. The sources are scarce, and one may indicate that the political and territorial annexation was more complex than a smooth process of progressive integration of the region into the Hittite kingdom. A timeline with the main information and events, according to rulers, seems useful for a summary. Over the course of 3 generations, between Tudalia I and Tudalia III, the history of Kizuwatna merges with that of the Hittite kingdom. The archaeological records, which we kind of skipped over, indicates that this incorporation also occurred material culturally. Interesting. If it is true that the innovation in the Cilician or Cilician assemblages with standardized pottery productions and the introduction of materials typical of the empire period predate the reign of Suppiluliuma. Against this precarious historical background, we can identify Kizuwatna as the source of at least some of the most substantial developments in the Hittite cultural and religious domains. These developments can be contextualized historically with the annexation of Kizuwatna to the kingdom, broadly speaking, but perhaps more specifically, also within the hypothesis that the union of Tudalia I and Nikhal Mahdi was an interdynastic marriage, perhaps connected with the roughly contemporary treaty with Shunashura. It can be argued that these events were part of a far-reaching intentional political plan. The appearance of Hurrian names among members of the Hittite royal family, the first of whom was Nikhal Mahdi, can be best explained if this queen was a native of Kizuwatna, and this had an impact on the immersion of a new onomastic tradition. Almost there. Kizuwatnan fingerprints are virtually everywhere in the cultural changes that characterize this period, especially in the religious sphere. In this sphere of influence of the royal family is in this domain, the influence of the royal family is universally recognized. If the 2 queens of Tudalia III were also Kizuwatnian, this would additionally point at the systematic nature of these unions, which over the course of a few generations led to the factual unification of the royal family of Hattusha with the highest Kizuwatnian nobility. This process may help explain the rapid political integration of Kizuwatna and the unique modalities of the process of its annexation with the end of the local dynasty. The scenario of a broader dynastic union seems to explain these dynamics very well, but in the absence of explicit evidence, it must at present remain. And then there's like talking about documentary timeline. Okay, it must at present remain a working explanation. Now, we're gonna read the chart. So Tudalia I in the Annals of Tudalia I, Tudalia and his father Kantuzili fight with Mua and Kartasura. According to Karuba, Kizuwatna was involved and/or the conflict happened in its territory, but this is uncertain. No explicit information on Kizuwatna. Treaty with Shunashura, parity treaty showing decreased prestige of Kizuwatna and the subordination de facto to the Hittites. It is the last known treaty of the series. Kizuwatna is formally independent and still has a local king, but it appears to be a subordinated kingdom. Adlocation or allocation of the deity of the night. Information of the transfer of the cult of the goddess of the night from Kizuwatna to Samuha at the time of Tudalia I. Presumably, Kizuwatna is under Hittite control. Tudalia I possibly, and then Arnuwanda the first. Joint Annals of Arnuwanda and Tudalia. Transit of armies to Cilicia. Local reconstruction activities during the co-regency of Tudalia and Arnuwanda. It says re in parentheses, so it could just be new construction as well. Indicates direct control of Kizuwatna and full incorporation. Protocol/oath for the men of Ismarika or Ismarega. Relocation of individuals from and to Kizuwatna. Some provisions show that its territories were considered an integral part of the Hittite kingdom. Indicates direct control of Kizuwatna and full incorporation. And then this is like under also Kantuzili, who I guess is like a priest. Yeah, he's a priest. Information on the appointment of Kantuzili as high priest of Teshob and Hebad in Kizuwatna. Various sources indicate that the Sangha corresponds to those of a local governor. So he's like instead of a priest king, a priest governor. If I remember, Sangha meant priest. Kind of, at least according to this. I may be jumbling some stuff. Indicates conclusion of local kingship, full incorporation in Hittite kingdom. Letter of K to Kashu. Dispute of Kashu concerning the restitution of some dependents of the priest. Indicates administrative duties and political powers of the Sangha. Kizuwatna is said to be Hantezis Aurus. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it again. Primary/vanguard watch post, a frontier district with special status. Tudalia III, Hakur Pura decree of Hattusili III. Information concerning the concentric invasions at the time of Arnuwanda and Tudalia III. Devastations in a broader area. Hittite loss of Ashua, Armatana, Hashtusha. The enemy made Kizuwatna, the city, i.e. Kumani, the border, and the city of Hattusha was burned down. Indicates the Hittites lost territories of the province of Kizuwatna, and that the enemy even reached into its core in Kilikia. It appears that Kizuwatna was not lost entirely, even at this time, though. Hurry and text from Samuha. Text concerning campaigns at the time of Tudalia, likely the third, at the command of Egli Tenu and Ili Sharuma, targeting Kizuwatna, along with Mukesh and Matani. Indicates military activities were necessary in the region, including Kizuwatna, after the concentric invasions. That's the hurrying text from Samuha. Hymn for the sun goddess of Irina. Information on the status of Kizuwatna as Kuriwana country, listed with Arzawa and Matani. The definition Kuriwana indicates equality of status with Arzawa and Matani, thus, at this time, at least a degree of formal independence. Supiliuma I. Appointment of Telepinu as Sangha. And then it says Kizuwatna had remained under Hittite control throughout, under the rule of the first priest, Kantuzili, or was reconquered during the comeback of Tudalia III and Shupiliuma. And then the next one is Deeds of Shupiliuma. The Sangha, Telepinu, has mandate over Syria after the first campaign. Kizuwatna is a province of the empire. Okay, back to the summary. However, the political and diplomatic conversions of Hattusha and Kizuwatna, with critical impact on the domains of language use, culture, religion, is an outstanding phenomenon in Hittite history and cannot simply be simply explained through a sudden infatuation of the Hattusha dynasty and eventually some Hittite religious elites with the exotic cults of this foreign land. The administrative need to regulate and carry out the cults of Kizuwatna when the region came under Hittite control was presumably a driver of these developments. Arguably, the political opportunity to display particular attention to the local cult administration could have been to some extent territorially specific. For example, if the religious institutions in charge of the cults were very influential in the lands, economically essential to the local structures, branched out in the political leadership of the territory, and so on. Still, elements such as the bulk importation of ritual literature and of the cults of local deities into central Anatolia between the end of the 15th and the first half of the 14th century, or the usage of the Hurrian, or the use of Hurrian and royal onomastics, as well as to some extent as spoken language, are more difficult to reconcile with a purely administrative necessity in regional context. Close ties between the Hittite and Kizzuwatnian elites through high-level diplomatic connections and the possible presence at the court of Hattusha of a number of high-ranking individuals, personnel, and servants coming from Kizzuwatna would have influenced the broader court environment, and these newcomers likely contributed to the propagation of Kizzuwatnian cultural elements among the Hattushan elites. Historically, this scenario integrates well with the hypothesis that Hittite Kizzuwatnian connections increase with the renewed diplomatic contacts and arrival of Nikal Mahdi and her entourage at Hattusha. The possible role of the queen in the education of the princes and princesses could have also been an important factor. Due to the dearth of explicit evidence, however, this reconstructive remains tentative. Afterwards, Kizzuwatna becomes an essential component, politically and culturally, of a truly new Hittite kingdom, as scholars have appropriately called it. Despite its demotion from independent kingdom to one province of a large empire, this land nonetheless maintained its distinctive identity within the Hittite Empire, which was displayed through the prestige of its local cults and religious traditions until the end of the Bronze Age and the fall of the empire itself. Thoughts and prayers, guys. I wonder if the Hittites they're still with us in our soul, man. Oh, and Kizzuwatna's there too. Okay, I am about to die, so see y'all. I hope you enjoyed this let's play of Herdcraft. So yeah, bye.